As we've talked about many times over the last couple of days, these are extraordinary times. At the same time, we're also faced with COVID-related constraints and unprecedented supply chain impact. And what do we know the producers want? Well, Robert McKenzie, MD of Macca's Australian Angus Beef, earlier on the stage today said, well, I'm an advocate for sharing to create a better ag ecosystem. The more we share, the stronger we'll be. We get together to share ideas on what works, so sharing data is important. There's so much untapped potential. In one of our final sessions for Evoke, we will talk about manufacturing models, about food security, about future trade relationships, carbon footprint, and of course, underpinning all of this, the opportunities and challenges that remain through supply chains. So joining us on stage, would you please welcome Rob Gordon, Group Chief Executive Officer of SunRice Group, Dr. Hermione Parsons, CEO of the Australian Logistics Council, Justin Webb, Executive Chairman and Co-founder of AgriWebb, and Kath Sullivan, National Rural Reporter from the ABC, to join us in the onshoring, offshoring and friendshoring.
Thank you so much for being here today and being part of the panel. I know this conversation is going to whip on through. Let's deal with the three main topics. Let's break them all down, beginning with friendshoring. Hermione, can you explain, one, what it is, and two, if it's a load of rubbish?
I think it's a load of rubbish. From my point of view, we're talking about commerce and we're talking about prices and we're talking about the needs of Australia in a serious way, not looking for hope and the notion of friends taking care of us. And a few world wars show us in the history, the modern history of the world, that, you know, we couldn't trust and then we can trust and we can't trust the next friend. So I think we need to be a little more grown up about it.
Do you want to add to that, Rob, from your perspective?
Yes, certainly. I agree. I think it's a very nice bumper sticker. But the reality is, a lot of the people who we think of as friends actually either don't need our products or have farm lobby groups which actually put significant barriers up in place. If you have a look at some of those who we may consider to be less friendly, they often are in need of our products from an agricultural perspective, and it's up to us to navigate the geopolitical tensions to be able to still service them and actually have some flexibility on where we might want to go, so that when there's a discontinuity in a relationship, we actually have other options. And I think if you buy into friendshoring or you buy into too much dependence on a supply chain in particular, and then it changes on you, if you don't have options, you tend to fare far worse than if you actually have plenty of options. And that's certainly something that we've tried to do.
And I think this is so interesting in light of, Bryce's comments just now about Australia's trading relationship with China, and you talk about all of the other geopolitical issues that have fed into that, and yet it remains such a valuable market for Australian produce. Do you want to come in here, Justin? You've been dealing with a lot of the retailers in Europe and the UK. Why is that important as part of this conversation?
Well, I think one of the key elements, a lot of the amazing discussions and the mic drop moments, everyone has been buying into sustainability and provenance and et cetera through the supply chain.
It sounds hot, doesn't it?
It sounds so good.
Does
and
anyone
of course,
know what it means?
Well, hopefully after the past 2 days we have a reasonable idea. But I think we've also all said, well, the consumer's going to pay for it, and I think there's a bit of a disconnect in there. One, fundamentally we are talking about a Malthusian trap. Whereby there just are too many mouths to feed. So we have to, one, be aware of a supply chain that is under enormous stress. And when you look at the fact that commodity prices, food prices, have been more volatile than just about any other asset price in the world due to supply constraints, that impact is terrifying when considering the weaknesses of our supply chain. Look what happens when there's a war in the Ukraine and a huge proportion of the key elements of fertilizer are threatened. The input costs of producers skyrocketed. When urea...
The returns also skyrocketed?
Well, sort of. They did, but not necessarily to the primary producers. I mean, when you then start looking at the attribution of value, right, one through the supply chain, but also back to the original producers. I mean, at the moment, a beef producer gets less than 20% of the end value of production. So I would challenge a lot of the frictions through the supply chain and actually come to the point of, no, the consumer shouldn't necessarily be paying more for provenance and sustainability and efficient supply chains. The retailer should. And that retailer needs to understand the pressure it's coming under from investors that are going to be looking at these publicly held companies and saying, no, I'm sorry, you have to actually absorb the cost of this. They have teams that are extraordinarily good at deflecting that cost. But I think that
not
pressure,
just that cost. We've seen here in Australia the major retailers write to producers recently, suppliers saying, don't come to us with the cup in hand. We've got no room to move as food inflation hits food prices. Should we rename this panel to Onshoring, Offshoring and Tangents? I feel like we're off and about, and there will be an opportunity to take questions. So I hope that you've got some ideas ticking over that we can put to our panel today. Rob, when you were listening to Justin then, how much of what he said did you agree with?
A fair amount, but I actually think that industry structures, it's all very well saying retailers will pay, industry structures are actually going to deflect that, which I guess is an agreement. It's actually about value propositions. So, I think over the course of the last couple of days, I've heard a lot of people say, the consumer won't pay. And I actually fundamentally disagree with that. And I'm not talking about paying for sustainability. I'm talking about we have phenomenal quality produce which already has high provenance and is well priced. And what we've got to do is make sure that we brand that, we sell that value, and I fundamentally believe that if you invest in a value proposition that either has IP or other forms of brand attachment, you will get rewarded for it. If you're not being rewarded for it, you've either misunderstood the consumer need, in other words, they don't see the same value as you think you're providing, or you're not telling them about it and explaining them why it's value. So to my mind, I think I'm much more optimistic about being able to get a premium for Australian ag, particularly with all of the consumer trends around provenance, enjoyment of food, convenience. The SunRice group has over the years branded ag, and let me give you an example. Our biggest single market is Papua New Guinea. It is an impoverished Pacific Island nation. We sell 80% of our rice in that market, it's the biggest market we have, at a premium of 10 to 15% versus our competition. Why? Because the consumers have so little money that they actually want to make, it's a big investment as a proportion of their disposable income to buy that food. And therefore they're prepared to pay for it because they can't afford to make a mistake. But you laugh, but it's incredible. You see people in the supermarket literally making a call, and they don't want to get home and have a product that fails because they don't have money to go back and buy again.
And I think that's a very different market to Australia, but a great example. I was hoping you would provide an example, and I wasn't laughing. It was Justin who was digging me in the ribs.
Sorry, no, Rob, I'm not going to let this one go through to the keeper because I spent a fair bit of time in PNG. I mean, the Minister of Agriculture, Benny Allen, was campaigning to restrict the importing of rice, and I know it's your biggest market. The government spends 600 million kina importing 400,000 tons of rice into Papua New Guinea every year, of which most of it is SunRice. And that's fantastic for coming back to the friendshoring argument. But that means a PNG local is buying a bag of rice for 6 kina off the shelf. Now, you break that down, that's about 22% of the GDP per capita per day of that individual person. Now, conversely, the minister was arguing that they wanted to grow rice onshore. PNG is one of the most productive agricultural spaces in the world, and if they did grow it onshore, it would be 50% less as a cost of product. Now, I don't think that's friend sharing. That's with the 1.3 billion of your profit. That's not fair.
So I've grown rice in Papua New Guinea, and I doubt you have, and I can tell you that your cost base is wrong. So why dedicate really fertile land in Papua New Guinea that can grow tropical fruits, coffee, cocoa, and actually produce one of the lowest returning crops that they can? Really poor use of land. But it gets away from the question in hand, which is, can we brand Australian rice and actually get a premium for it? And we can. We've done it for years. We've got markets around the world. Saudi, perhaps you're more comfortable talking about that because there's much more wealth at the top end. Nevertheless, we offer branded opportunities
Right.
all the way through, which give a good value proposition to consumers at different points in the hierarchy of wealth. And you can do that in Australia, you can do it here. And I think fundamentally we ought to be thinking about Australian produce, not just rice, in that way, that we ought to be able to get a premium. Part of the brand promise is sustainability. It's a bundle of offer, and sustainability is one of the aspects of it.
I feel like we're learning a lot very quickly. Hermione, if I could bring you into the conversation, please.
Thank you.
As the peacekeeper.
Wrong.
Right,
Wrong.
I'm off. Your work with the Freight Council, we've seen through the war in Ukraine and COVID, all of a sudden everybody thinks they're an expert on supply chains, a term that many Australians may never have heard or used prior to these global events.
Yes.
What don't they know about the supply chain?
Well, the supply chain sector, freight logistics supply chain and supply chain, end-to-end supply chain. I come out of the food industry, out of the wholesale markets, and I began my career as a geographer. So I'll get back to geography in a minute. But I reckon the hidden enabler in 2019 was supply chain freight logistics. No government was interested in it much. No people were interested in it much. And we were going to ministers of the government saying, hey, there's something called supply chain and freight logistics. It's really important to our economy, and we have a very serious skills shortage and workforce shortage issue. And by the way, our infrastructure doesn't join up, our train sets don't join to a port, and we've got quite a few issues happening. Careful what you wish for, COVID. What happened since then is that the slogan terms are bandied around like people know what they're talking about. So the terms supply chain, onshore, offshoring, friendshoring, terms like just in time to just in case. And what I'm finding is wherever I go now, because I'm involved in all the jurisdictions, every government department has people that put supply chain next to their title. I'm the manager of supply chain for health. I'm the manager of supply chain for food. And the real problem with that is that if you don't have an understanding of the fundamentals and the assumptions at every point of a complex system that has so much interdependency at every point, you will make wrong decisions. And we will have the wrong infrastructure, the wrong investments, and there are loads of examples of it. So at the moment, what I hear all the time is people keenly interested in it, which I welcome, but we need to actually make sure that there is a knowledge base underpinning people's thoughts and ideas. Otherwise, it's just opinions. Everyone's got a belly button, everyone's got an opinion. How useful are they? So I do worry about that. Getting back to geography, I can take over too. Getting back to geography.
It's usually a different expression than belly button. But
Okay, I know. I'm being polite.
Yeah.
You can think it, Rob.
But getting back to geography, and I would like to go back to that point, I believe differently that our issues are far more significant than what is being represented. We are a small island nation at the backside of the earth. We are 26 million people only. That is tiny. We are on the end, we're an end destination port, it's called a country, end destination port on the north-south trade routes. They are the minor routes. The major routes in international shipping, in international air freight, are the east-west trades between the major city nations of the Northern Hemisphere. We are tiny. We are also an island nation. That means every import, every export requires a ship or a plane. We do not control the global shipping industries of the world. We do not control in any way air freight either. Prices are going up like mad. The price of a barrel of petrol at the moment, of fuel, is going up. It's 36% higher than it was in 2021. We have massive issues that we need to seriously talk about in terms of the geography of our country. Value adding is absolutely critical. Ag tech is a fantastic industry. We need to do more.
So should we be growing and manufacturing more here in Australia?
Well, I think we have to. We can't rely on other countries where we are dependent for critical things. When aviation closed down 96% of all air freight capacity ended in Australia on one day when we went into lockdown in March 2020. On that day, every import, every export that we rely on air freight stopped. We couldn't get remember the goldfish factor? We couldn't get hand sanitizer. We couldn't get masks. We couldn't get vaccines. We couldn't get the incredible equipment we need or spare componentry into the country. Therefore, the International Freight Assistance Mechanism was brought in to help. We are not over COVID yet, and we have very serious issues that we need to talk about in terms of our country and how our country is going to survive in the future and do well. And it's a freight logistics issue. Very much in cost.
You talk about Australia at the back end of the world, which I don't really like to think about. But Rob, SunRice, I think, uses maybe 160 different shipping routes around the world. So you're well and truly familiar with where Australia is in the program. How easily have those shipping routes been disrupted over the past?
Yeah, 2020 and 2021 were not only very difficult for everybody with regard to COVID, but and all the supply chain issues, but SunRice was also exposed to the Australian drought. We had the second and third smallest crops on record. Only 5% of our global demand could be supplied from the Australian rice crop. Under normal circumstances, people would think that our role was to export the Australian crop and market it around the world. A decade ago, coming out of the millennium drought, despite the fact there was a run of really good years, we decided to plan for the future. And we didn't decide on a static, fixed state that was going to be the future. We built a nimbleness and supply chain options through our network. So today we have 12 different countries of origin, and that is not for just the commodity. It's actually supply chains which process, pack into all of the, and is capable of delivering to all of the nearly 60 countries around the world that we service. So when we got hit, we actually had very little rice in country, and you'll recall, rice was like toilet paper, one of those things that whipped off the shelf. Now, we'd planned our year, and we only had enough domestically to service the year, and it all went out the door in the first few months. And then we looked to turn on all of the different supply chains around the world, and at that point, Vietnam shut down because food security was a significant issue. They banned exports of rice with 2 days' notice. We had a mill full, ships at the dock being loaded, etc. We lost Cambodia the next day, and we lost a third origin the day after. But we had options, and we were able to play all that. But what it brought home for me was the fragility of some of the supply chains, and the fact that food security in times of real significant need are really quite important. But if you have a look at the shipping, we would have. The shipping was disrupted to the point where our worst route went up 17x. So in other words, Cambodia to the west coast of the US for fragrant rice, about $1,200 a box pre-pandemic. Mid-pandemic, $17,500 US a box. Rice wasn't worth that much. Only televisions could pay for that. So we would have a start a month with 100,000 tons of orders.
So what happens? I mean, obviously the trauma counselling's worked, but
I'm actually only 32, so it's taken a toll. Well, I think what it calls out is that I think supply chains were really very bare. They literally were to the point where I think all of the fat had been taken out, and I think that means that they're more fragile and then can't recover. And I think there is an overreaction now. We're seeing hoarding. We're seeing nation states hoard food. And what that means is that it doesn't come to market. And I think this cuts to the theme. Australia has a massive exportable surplus which we need to be paid for, but it means you need access to foreign markets, hopefully privileged, but it's not just about where it's friendly. China is our biggest, most valuable market. It may not be our biggest friend at the moment. We need to navigate it, and we need to find other markets, which mean we're not so reliant on those that may turn against us.
Okay, so diversity sounds easy when you put it like that. But what if we just focused on servicing the market here? Maybe if we're a small country, we've got the ability to grow a lot of our own food and fibre, maybe we should just not worry about any shipping routes and just send stuff up the Hume.
Isolationism, I don't think is probably the best plan for it. what is it, 70% of our agricultural production is exported. So it's fundamental that we need to do that. And to all the points that both of you have very articulately laid out, we need to engage with multiple different trading partners. I think one of the elements that we can do, and we are all here gathered with an interest in this, is looking at how technologies can perhaps give us an unfair competitive advantage to both brand and predict and deliver our premier produce from primary production that's relatively clean, relatively sustainable. And I think that branding, to come to, is actually incredibly powerful. We have struggled and missed trade deals because of the negative elements that we haven't been able to come together as a community and quash. Examples are when Aldi came to Australia seeking to, because the UK has to import, they do not produce enough food to feed the 60 million people there. They wanted to buy lamb from Australia to bring in. They didn't because of the impact of mulesing, and even when and it was really actually the marketability of mulesing. And even when they could say, well, all right, we've got a regulatory platform and we're tracking which farms do and don't mules, they wouldn't trust it. And that's a real concern when global businesses aren't leveraging it. So technology should be that data layer that provides the evidence for us to be superior and capture premium value.
Well, it'd be interesting to see if the free trade deal with the UK, once it's ratified over there, might address some of those concerns. Speaking of trade in the UK, Rob, you had a fantastic anecdote that I hope you wouldn't mind sharing about when you were trying to sell rice into the UK.
Yes, so it's a never tell a journo a secret. So when Brexit happened, which I'll keep my own views about that, but never it happened, we as a rice producer had been blocked from entry to the EU, which should be a friend, largely because a very big farm lobby group, they produce similar types of rice. And as a consequence, effectively, there's a very significant tariff, about €200 a tonne, and a tiny, tiny quota, 1,000 tonnes a year. So when Brexit happened, we thought, well, at last, we'll actually have a nation that doesn't grow rice. It's not Portugal, Spain, Italy, etc. Turned up, and we got phenomenal support from the Australian government negotiating team, opportunity to brief, etc. And I was told, well, the UK have said that this is an agricultural FTA. We mustn't allow any rice imports from Australia because it'll damage our rice industry. Now, you may be able to tell by my accent, I do hail from the UK. The irony was the Whitehall economist they sent to argue with me was an Aussie. So I actually did point out that I knew no rice was grown, and this comes to the friendshoring and all the rest of it. So our trade negotiators managed to get temperate climate rices in, but because there is a very strong basmati trade there, which is in the food manufacturing and processing sector, they don't grow basmati there, and we don't grow basmati, but nevertheless, all long grain rice we're still excluded from into the UK. And I think that talks to the political lobbying of basically an industry sector in the UK that said don't actually challenge our basmati trade. So this is what I mean about we need to be nuanced, we need to be to lobby, find really the markets that are valuable, get into them and take advantage of them and move on to others as well.
There may be some lobbyists here just sort of dreaming of having that sort of impact, I think. When you touched on it there, you were talking about trade, private deals or between the retailers. But it was quite interesting. We heard the Federal Agriculture Minister Murray Watt spruiking his recent trip to Berlin to let the EU know what good people we are here in Australia and how we're not raping and pillaging the earth and we're all very good custodians of the land, which he says he's done a great job at. But is it not interesting that he's had to go there in the first place and to try and spruik that message? Just the example of the rice growing, how easy is it for misconceptions or ideas, for example, like the mulesing, to get up, and how detrimental can they be?
Look, I think that to bifurcate the question, do ministers have to go? I mean, sure, ministers, they need to spend some taxpayer money, so
we can Berlin.
On they go. I mean, to be facetious, of course, a lot of advantage trade deals have do need an engagement and to a degree an element of posturing between two nations to demonstrate the collaboration. But I think as operators within the supply chain, and ultimately as Australians, a role as primary producers and first level processors, we best demonstrate the efficacy and the superiority of our product, its provenance, its sustainability, by demonstrating that through the information and the data that we're gathering, and putting a marketing message around that says we're not just claiming to be green or claiming to be clean or claiming to be low in antibiotic usage or etc. We are validating that with evidence, and that is irrefutable when looking at a comparative evidence for trade deal and trade. The UK, we seem to be talking a lot about that, but post-Brexit is struggling with its own populace because they're looking at importing eggs and meat from the United States, yet the standards around production of eggs and meat from hormone usage and chlorine wash are not the same as in the EU. And so there's uproar in the public. Whereas enter Australia that can say, we're clean, we're green, we've got better standards, and here's the data and evidence to show it. And I think it's such an opportunity to move the needle on a global scale with the people that are at this event and in this room. I think it's amazing.
That's a nice upbeat note.
I can be positive sometimes.
We're going to open up for questions in just a moment. Hermione, you mentioned that COVID's not over yet. When will we be back to normal?
What does normal mean? I
normal?
think we're all a bit odd, but what does normal mean?
Will we ever see the supply chain bounce back and be as resilient?
I totally agree with you about we need to use technology is never a silver bullet. I've worked in traceability a long time and still do. It's really, really important. But what I think is terribly important to get us back to anything that remotely looks like what we might have been a while ago, that is possibly living off the generations of people that had had great fortune, no war, no pandemics, all sorts of things that our parents and our grandparents didn't have necessarily here. But I'm very concerned that we need to, as a nation, be very realistic and very honest. We have had major floods. Those floods have destroyed roads all through Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, West Australia, Northern Territory. The cost of fixing up those roads is something like $4.8 billion in New South Wales alone. Those roads are not going to be fixed because we don't have the money, because we actually had a pandemic and that sort of hit at the coffers a bit. So we've got very dire circumstance, in my view, and I'm actually usually optimistic and a very Pollyanna sort of person, but in this issue I think we have to be realistic and we have to use everything we can. We have to use technology. We have to actually have a workforce. We have to make sure that women are part of that workforce. The workforce we're talking about is a really big issue across Australia. We don't have the warm bodies, we don't have the skilled people, and we don't have the university or TAFE systems doing what our country needs. That's a big issue. Our infrastructure is a problem. We keep building stuff that doesn't join up. Joined up thinking. It seems simple, but if you don't have your roads and your rail leading to a port and that port being adequate in capacity to move the ships in and out, if you don't have your airports in the right location, seriously, the costs go nuts and we can't survive it. We're not the smartest people in the world. Ooh, shock. We're not. There are lots of smart people in the world. There are lots of amazing nations in the world. Lots of extraordinary things happening. And we're you didn't like back end of the earth? In trading terms, we're the back end of the earth. We're a tiny market. We're very clever, we're beautiful, we love each other, and I love living here. But let's be realistic.
So what's gone wrong? Is it just that people are thinking, the thinking's too short-sighted and everybody's looking after their own little
I think we
patch?
haven't prepared. We've always thought we wouldn't have a pandemic. Decades and decades of scientists have said we would not just have one pandemic, we would have a series of pandemics with a series of variants per pandemic. That has been forecast since the 1950s, the 1960s. We've known that, but we didn't prepare for it because we're not taking things seriously enough. We're not taking workforce seriously enough. We're not, even now, we talk about the skills crisis. We don't have the bodies to be able to deal with the need in agriculture, in supply chain, in freight logistics, in manufacturing, in engineering, in infrastructure. We don't have it in any of those areas. So we need to start getting entirely realistic. Let's go back to basics. And part of the basics is to say, we need the best technology we can to show provenance. We need the smartest people. No, sorry, we won't have the smartest people. We need skilled people who really can work in the ways that our community and our society needs, including in sustainability. But I think what we've done is we've always pretended we're the smartest. We've always thought we do things better than everyone else. And I think there's an arrogance about this beautiful country that I love. And that arrogance has been shaken a bit because of COVID, but now we're also a bit like goldfish. We forget things very quickly, but we still have had floods. We've still got wrecked roads. We don't have coastal shipping.
Uncertainty comes quick. That was something that
Don't get me started.
Okay. I'm not sure I can stop you. At this stage, we might open for questions. If anybody did have a question for our panel here, Justin, Hermione, and Rob, I know that to the person in the pink.
Thanks very much. Bill Herditch from the MacDoc Ag Group. People have always sort of said government order, do this and that, and Coppo's call for a strategy for agritech's fantastic, we need that. But when I think about all the shocks that have happened, we've talked about the pandemic, the reaction of the pandemic, the rock lobsters didn't turn off, they got turned off. Government knee-jerk policies have done a lot of damage, and I just want to ask the panel, what is the role of government and the sovereign risk issue on decision making? I mean, live cattle exports stopped overnight because of a knee-jerk reaction. So I just want to maybe ask the question about that, the role of government in sort of limiting, inhibiting and stopping things rather than enabling.
Thanks, Bill. Apologies, I've left my glasses at home, so...
Well, thanks, Bill. That's a great question, and also thanks for the work that you're doing in the sustainability piece. Look, big part of the reason why live export, obviously there were some pretty rough videos that came out and switched off public opinion. So whether that was government or not, but the abattoirs that were shut down by China, that was evidenced by a lack of information, and I keep using the word, but data tracking to pass the auditing tests for the cleanliness of the product that was coming through. And so making sure that we are implementing and leveraging technologies that Coppo was just putting forward will be the safety net that says, no, you can't validate the shutting down of an abattoir because
China was
we've
going to
proven
say, we're not buying meat from abattoirs A, B, and C.
But they didn't say that. They said you failed the checks.
It was the same with the lobsters.
If you have the evidence, it's irrefutable. That's the point that I'm trying to make. And so it can be political, and that's fine. They just go, that's it, we're not going to buy anything from you. But that's a political statement, and that gets pinned on government relations.
Yeah.
But it's harder to make rather than saying, oh, but you failed an audit. And if we can demonstrate that we're not failing audits, that we do have traceability and provenance, and we surpass those quality standards, it's much harder to have those supply chains shut down.
But the case of rock lobster, I mean, I really do think we need to not think about this as government fixing things or government breaking things. From my experience with, I was drawn into the International Freight Assistance Mechanism a great deal, which was when air freight stopped on one day and the high-value agricultural and fishery product couldn't get out of the country, they just couldn't. It couldn't get out. Highly perishable product needs planes to get to the five-star hotels or restaurants in China or wherever the markets are that they go. If you don't have the planes working, then you can't get the freight there. So what I'd like to bring that back to is the realities of that first example that I think you're referring to about when aviation stopped and the rock lobster couldn't get out. The next question, though, is why doesn't every Australian have wonderful lobster every Christmas and all through the year, given that we have such fantastic... Why can't we be a domestic market really looking towards the opportunities there? And I think that we also have to stop thinking that government's going to solve the problem. There isn't enough money in the coffers. There's just not. And anyone that thinks that we're going to get over this simply because the government going and creating new demand overseas is missing the point again about we need ships and we need planes to get the stuff there. So what arrangements are we going to be making to enable our exports to get to different countries when we want them to? What arrangements are we going to do as an island nation to deal with the fact that we don't have our own, say, aircraft fleet? What, at the moment, there's something like 600,000 pilots worldwide in short supply. And in Australia, we have a terrible problem of the shortage of pilots. Add another complication. Most pilots are trained in the Defence Forces. The Defence Forces are paying a hell of a lot more money now to keep those pilots. Those pilots fly usually commercial planes. They're not available for freight. They're not taking freight because they want passengers. Passengers pay more. That allows them to recoup some of the profit lost and the costs incurred because of COVID. So they're taking passengers at capacity of 95% now, not 75%. So there is no room for freight in the belly of the planes. What do we do with our high-value agricultural and fishery products? How do we get them out if there's high perishability?
The taxpayer subsidises it when the...
Well, we need to be value-adding. We need to do a whole lot of stuff. The taxpayer's not going to be able to subsidise because we don't have them.
It's not the answer. Look, I think to
But
my
we
mind,
did. That was essentially what the freight adjustment mechanism was.
It was a crisis. It was there for a crisis
Short-term.
period, short-term, to deal with that extraordinary position we had not been in before.
Yeah.
and it's
it
when
was
market
brilliant.
fails, right? So actually we can't, we need markets to work. And that's the role of government, is to ensure that we're facilitated to get access somewhere. And then it's up to us to actually take advantage of that. If there's market failures in things, it's actually about examining that and finding a way to actually fix it or bring the market in so that it can actually solve the problem. If we expect governments to solve the problem, we're not going to win anything. And the infrastructure is a classic example. It's very hard for the market, other than public-private partnership, to solve infrastructure. But infrastructure we need. You have a look at an awful lot of grain growers at the moment this last year have not brought their grain to market because they can see international prices are significantly higher. There's a big spread between the international market and the domestic. Why? Because the ports are congested. So actually all of the ports are full. So if you've got grain, you're looking at an international price you can't access and a domestic price which is discounted as a result. And that's a direct hit to growers' pockets. And that's because we don't have the infrastructure.
We used to think just a couple of years ago, all of our freight was grain was headed to the east coast. Now we've had to turn everything around, turning the Titanic around to get it. Hopefully you can see my hands explaining. We've got another question here and then to you in just a moment, if that's okay.
Hi, I'm Samantha Jewell from Earth. I've got a soil, carbon and biodiversity platform. And my question's to you, Rob, because you were talking about clean and green as a marketing aspect, but how much is the value add in the nutrient density? Is that starting to come up in interest in the international markets? Because it's kind of interrelated with carbon and biodiversity. The nutrients are correlative.
Yeah, I think it depends which consumer you're talking about. And again, I sort of was talking to my colleagues earlier about, consumers turn up in different places and different guises, and I'm a different consumer of different products depending on the occasion, for example. So I don't just buy the consumer. So when you talk about nutrient density, for example, we believe that there's a desire, there's a consumer trend to increase protein intake. And so there's a section of consumers who really value that very highly and will pay for it. There's a bunch of people who don't care. You basically have to tailor your offer accordingly. We are seeing, things like, for example, gluten-free or gluten intolerance, really significant trend, and it's real. And what's more, people will pay a premium to make sure that they get products that suit that. High protein, low GI. We have a low GI rice, which again, people particularly in Asia who like eating white rice, not brown rice, but nevertheless are potentially suffering from a disease of affluence. has diabetes, type 2, who actually want a rice that is actually a low GI rice. So these are all sort of consumer segments that you can tailor an offer for.
Okay, thanks.
And we've just got a minute to go, so...
Trevor Perryman, I'm from a consultancy company. I just wanted to share two things make two comments, I guess. This time last year I was MD of a malting company, Malt Europe, Australia and New Zealand, and we went through the same kind of issues as you, Rob. When all the supply chain collapsed, we had brewers all over Southeast Asia crying out for malt. So they were actually stocked out in certain times and couldn't make beer. And then when the supply chain opened up again, there was an overreaction to the point where I did have some customers talking to me about building storage, enough storage to store a year's worth of malt, so this would never happen again. My point about that is that we are not alone in this topic, grappling with what is going to work. To your premise of the talk of changing supply chain landscape, I think that's always the case. Cost is the driver. Whether industries are moving offshore, onshore to friendly places or not friendly places is really driven by cost, unless there's a nationalisation of industries. Now, I think in Australia we don't want to go down that way. It doesn't drive efficiencies. And also, I don't think anyone here wants to spend $100 on a T-shirt when we're used to spending $20 on a T-shirt. So I don't think that's going to change. I think where we've got to concentrate as a nation and as an industry, we need to focus in on where supply chain logistics link up into ports, to your point earlier on. I think all those sorts of efficiencies is where our focus has got to be, not on nationalising industries or selecting winners, because I think that as a nation we can't afford that. And by the way, 70-80% of our agricultural produce is sold overseas. So if we put up the barrier, everyone else will.
I'm going to have to do my best. Tony Jones, we'll take that as a comment. Thank you so much, Trevor, and to everyone for your questions and for being here so late in the piece. We do appreciate it. To Rob, Hermione and Justin, thank you. Thank you.